Well, welcome to the Ordinary Discipleship Podcast. I'm Jesse Cruikshank, and today we have my friend Lance Ford. And Lance and I were just catching up before we started recording, and we have been friends for a little over 10 years now, known each other. Lance worked with the Foursquare denomination when I was doing denominational work. And Lance, it's so good to have you here with us today. Will you share a little bit about yourself for our audience so they can get to know you too?
It's always good to visit with you, Jesse, whether we're on the air or not, right? So, in all the places we run into each other. So, a little bit about me. I am entering into the last lap of my run. I hope it's a long lap. I hope it's the longest lap I've had, but so far I've had three 20-year segments. So that makes me 61 years old. I grew up in Texas since I went into full-time vocational ministry at 19. So 2/3 of my life, it's what it's been, well over 40 years of everything from, youth pastoring to co-pastoring to planting churches and really the last 20 years. So I spent 20 years doing that. And then the last 20 years now has really been more, writing and coaching, consulting, and just a mix of all that. But it's all about, raising men and women up, in the Lord to do the things of God for the sake of the world. A lot of that revolves around the church. Almost all of it revolves around the church in one manner or another. So that's pretty much what my life's about. And my wife and I were able to raise three kids. So we've got three kids. We got our first grandbaby due before the end of 2025. And so we're excited about that. Yeah, we'll celebrate our 40th year of marriage next year. So
You have a lot of books. What are some of the books out there that you've written?
actually, the first book I wrote was with Alan Hirsch. That was 15 years ago. We wrote a book called Right Here, Right Now, which is just a very practical missional living stuff, trying to land some of Alan's brain stuff on the ground. That was what it was. I always called it missional for dummies. That's what that stuff was. And then Brad Briscoe and I wrote several books together. We wrote a book called Missional Quest, wrote a handbook that's been used a lot in groups called Missional Essentials. In 2012, I mean, the subject I know that we're going to talk about today goes into this. Had a book published called Unleader that really dealt with a lot of issues I was seeing then in the leadership culture that we have in the church today. And so I've really focused more and more on that the last few years. I feel like that's my ultimate call or my ultimate gift to the body of Christ is around leadership reform. So that's really what I've focused on more the last few years. What I feel like is my ultimate calling is to deal with that. So yeah.
What I remember about Unleader is how it has a very compelling cover because it's got the word crossed out, right? It's like,
Mhm.
maybe not that. And you unpack what I like about it is you unpack a bit of the mythology around leadership and I remember growing up, well, so I went into full-time ministry when I was also 19 and trained
Mm.
people in leadership development, but we train people in servant leadership, which as a guide in an outdoor ministry was just a very, very different posture than I'm the head of an organization and I get to tell you what to do, right? So a guide carries the
Right.
extra weight, sets up the tent, sets up like it literally is service.
Yeah.
At the same time you're keeping people alive. And so I felt like your book kind of brought back some of that servant leadership kind of ethos that was kind of missing. Now we're 12, 13 years later, and you have a new book about leadership. Before we talk about, and get into the Atlas Factor, why did you feel compelled to write another leadership book? Like what didn't happen in that decade or so between Unleader and and Atlas Factor that
Yeah.
you were like, "Man, we gotta go into this further."
Yeah. Well, really because I haven't seen much change in our systems, especially after COVID. I thought, well, maybe there's a chance that pastors will get it and will realize that we need a new change, or we need to change the way we're leading. But it seemed like that didn't happen. In fact, more than anything, most pastors just doubled down, and most organizations doubled down. In fact, started trying to make even bigger churches and more multi-site churches, and became more corporate in their leadership than ever before. So I just felt like, well, maybe there's a different metaphor, and I just stumbled along it, really, that maybe we can get the message through with this metaphor actually that Paul used. So that's really why, Jesse, is that I just feel like that we're so addicted to leadership, leadership, leadership. Well, I felt like this back when I wrote on leader, but it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed, despite the empirical data that shows that the church continues to be in trending decline, regardless of whether we have more churches or bigger churches than we ever have. We've got less people, than we have per capita. We're in a long trend that's not going to end well. If you want to know where we're headed in the American church, go look at the stats for the European church 60 years ago. That's and the trends just can overlay, because we're headed where they were, and so now it's hard to find the church in Europe. You have to look in the nooks and the crannies, but that may be God getting his way, right?
Yeah, I think that the stats are that we've like 40,000 people have left the church in the last 5 years. And even if you wanna, lean into the moves of God that are happening on college campuses and the people getting baptized and getting saved, they're not actually going to church.
Mhm.
So, maybe in a few years, but they're doing parachurch ministries, they're doing these campus ministries, but they're not
Mhm.
necessarily getting plugged in and finding a place in existing church. So even if there's a beginning of a wave, or at least an awakening, a move of the Lord there, it's still not translating into, 1, greater church attendance, and 2, more churches. Like, I
Yeah.
think I just saw that they expect that 15,000 churches will close this year. And just for context for the audience, in 2019, 8,000 churches were planted and 6,000 churches were closed in 2019. Haven't
Mhm.
seen any data from 2020 or 20 to 2024. Nobody kept records. So all the
Y
churches that probably closed then, which
Mhm.
in a lot of places was probably like 30%. But
Yeah.
then just in 25, 15,000 churches, and I don't really know very many organizations that are church planting. So we're
And
seeing a
there's
contraction
around
for sure.
1,500. Yeah, we're definitely seeing contraction, and there's around 1,500 to 1,700 pastors leave the ministry every month.
But we've been focused for probably about 50, 60 years on this leadership development pipeline as a process for training up ministers and pastors. In your new book, Atlas Factor, you kind of break down and did some research on the history
Mhm.
of this. So tell us what you discovered, because I find this part fascinating about the history of the Christian leadership as a
Yeah.
term in Christian leadership industry.
The word leadership is a new word. Relative to linguistics, or relative to our history, it's a very new word. And what I stumbled along this a few years ago when I was doing some research. I've got an old Oxford Universal Dictionary that I bought at a used bookstore 30 years ago. It's 4 or 5 inches thick. It's like a boat anchor, right? So I went over and I grabbed that dictionary and I opened it up. Because it's so good with linguistics, it goes into the history of the and the evolution of a word. So that it's not uncommon to go in there and find a word, and there to be a half a page, maybe even a page, maybe even a page and a half on the definition of a particular word. That's why it's so thick. So I had the 1955 version, and I started looking up the word leadership, and I couldn't find it. It was not in the Oxford Dictionary, the 1955, as a definition. And to be honest, I did finally find it in one sentence, as a that was it was used in defining the word leader. which is really funny because the word leadership was not even defined in the 1955 Oxford Universal Dictionary. In the 1915 Noah Webster Dictionary, it's not there. Okay. So this is a new word. Now, and trust me, I've done tons of interviews, and people will go, oh, wait, the leadership's always been around. The Chinese were studying leadership, and sure, absolutely. There's leadership in the Bible from Genesis on. I'm not saying there's not leadership. What I'm saying is what we call leadership and what Jesus would have called leadership is not the same animal by any stretch. What we've done is we have taken the secular, what Jesus called the work of the Gentiles, we've taken that and imported it straight into the church. And we've sprinkled a little Jesus sprinkles on it. Now, sometimes we don't even do that. We just do it like the world did it. So anyway, I'm doing this research. So this took me down this rabbit hole. Started finding out that even in the secular world, the word leadership, the first time you start seeing it in any type of periodicals or books is in the mid to late 1800s. You just see it a few times. There was a conference in the 1920s that used the word leadership, but it just was not this common word that we use. I mean, even to 1966, when Peter Drucker wrote his famous book, The Effective Executive, he wasn't focusing on leadership. He called it management. So in fact, the word management was used much more then. And then it evolved into leadership, and we manage people.
Just to make sure that I'm tracking, what I've tracked is like the movement of people, and before the 1800s, you don't have social mobility. Like, you have a class system, you're born into a
Mm-hmm.
trade, you're born into a tier, a caste system, a class
Yep.
system. And so you are like a good version of your trade, but there's not like the ability to change your class, right?
Yeah, you've got
you can't,
almost
there's
no
no
chance.
ladder, there's no pipeline. You're just either
Mm-mm.
good or bad at your job, or you bring
Yeah,
honor or
you
dishonor.
play with the cards that were dealt you, right?
So it makes sense to me then that the late 1800s, we start to have social mobility in our world. It's a new thing, mostly driven by, I mean, you're from the West, I live in the West. The westward expansion, where you could now change your class system. You can,
Yep.
it makes sense then to me that you'd start to see sprinklings of this idea. But then even so,
Yes.
right, it's management. You're not changing your social status
Right. And
necessarily.
what really gave it that jump was the Industrial Revolution. So in the early 1900s, there was a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor from Bethlehem Still, that he is considered to be the father of modern management, which is modern leadership. So he wrote a little book called The Art of Scientific Management. And so he just started using clocks and quotas to organize and to run things in these steel mills and in these big factories. And so he started creating a different, this is where you got the division of blue collar and white collar. And so you would have these bosses up in these towers right in the middle of these big warehouses, these big glass, they could look around all four, and they're yelling orders to people. And so and when you read his book, it's wild, because part of what he was wanting to do was good. He was wanting to make these industries more profitable, but he wanted the men to get paid part of that profit the more that they performed. So he's weeding out the best he knows how quick you ought to be able to load a ton of pig iron and move it from this side to the rail carts or whatever. And so he started
As long as
measuring
you're the average
everything.
size, right? As long as you're the right
e-
height with the right strength,
exactly,
because
and
this is why you and I
all
are
that mattered.
so excited. Like, nobody else knows about Taylorism and how much it
Taylor,
has shaped our everything about our world,
everything,
and
doesn't it?
everything. Well, the way they design those things, he studied the way they design prisons, and that's how
Yes.
they design the management supervision. But anyway, keep going. Keep nerding out
Yeah, I
about
mean,
Taylorism.
Taylorism, I mean, so you and I could sit here for the next 5 hours and talk about Taylorism, and the thing is people don't realize it runs our life today. It totally runs our life. And so and if obviously you've read his material, the things he says about some men are so stupid, you can't trust them. They're stupid, they're lazy. So that was two of his assumptions, that people are stupid and people are lazy. So this is why you have to stay on them all the time. But then you've got a few people that can be the thinkers, right? But you got the thinkers and the doers. Well, what happened was as Taylorism caught on, of course, Henry Ford started using it, and it started moving everywhere. But then it started moving from the factory floor all the way up right into the C-suite. That's where we got the C-suite. That's where we got all this. So
Where we got the
management theory,
IQ test is applying it to
all
the
of that,
military.
all of that came from that. And so, but the fundamental thought is that people, you can't trust people to order their own schedule, and you can't trust them to give a good day's work. So you have to manage them. And so this stuff started going throughout, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. Then by the 1950s, you started seeing some books on leadership start emerging. Now, and I'll just jump forward because once again, you and I are like we're in a candy store on this subject. But think about this, Jesse. So I get up to studying into the 1960s, and I'm still not finding any Christian book with the word leadership in the title. 1967, the most famous Christian leadership book from the 1960s, Oswald Sanders' Spiritual Leadership. He uses the term in his book, 1967. But even by the 1960s, and I've done tons of research for this. I've talked to the biggest booksellers in the world. I can only find 10 or 11 books, Christian books, with the word leadership in the title from the
Wow.
1960s. Okay, so this is to emphasize this is a new thing. This is a new thing, this focus on leadership. So by the 1970s, now the church growth movement, get this. So when does the church growth movement start? Well, it starts in the mid 60s, really starts getting cooking in the late 60s. And you've got two factors coming here. You've also obviously got Fuller Seminary that starts the Institute of Church Growth, but you've also got Robert Schuller. He actually starts his own institute. In fact, as we're recording this, we're just days away from the 50th anniversary of Willow Creek Community Church. They started in 1975. Now, Willow has done a good job. In fact, while Hybels was there, he did a good job of scrubbing their history as well as he could. But he was a direct disciple of Robert Schuller, and many of the tactics that he used directly came from Schuller. All of it goes back to Norman Vincent Peale and Peter Drucker. Okay. So these guys had a huge shaping upon what we see today. And the reason I say that is because Hybels or Schuller is definitely the father of the modern day attractional seeker church. Hybels took it to another level. Today, somebody could blindfold you, take you into a church service, take the blindfold off, and you wouldn't know whether you're in a Methodist church, a Baptist church, a charismatic church. You wouldn't know. Why? Because everything looks the same. They're singing the same songs. The ceiling's dark, the room's dark, the lights, depending on their budget, are going everywhere. If they can afford a smoke machine, they got that. They're singing the same songs. You wouldn't have had that 35, 40 years ago, because we have now what I call the neo-attractional church. So we've just upped it to a different level. But what happened was in this mid 70s, as the church growth movement was taking off and they started getting bigger churches, they had to run those things and they had to try to figure out how do they run them. And so they had no place to turn because there was no Christian leadership
At
books
least
and
as far as,
conferences
like, a
on it.
large group, right? Because you had large
No,
events,
no,
but all your
for these
discipleship or whatever was done 100 at a time locally,
Yes,
neighborhood,
exactly.
parish, everybody multiplied instead of making a
Right,
big
and they
unit.
took care of themselves, right? Which is the way the church is designed to do, is self-management. But as the churches got bigger and grew faster, they started importing directly leadership principles from the business world. And then, of course, we know by the 90s, Bill Hybels has the Willow Creek Association cooking, and then they create the Global Leadership Conference, and it was game on by that time, and it was all about leadership, leadership, leadership. So whereas you can't even find a dozen Christian books on leadership in the 1960s, now there are tens of thousands of them. It's just everywhere, and so it has supplanted the word servant, completely eradicated the word servant and the word minister. So I've always said, if you were to go back to, let's say, 1980, and you're in some town, and you go to a Denny's, or you go to some local diner for breakfast, and you were to look over and see 4 or 5 of the local pastors sitting around having breakfast, if someone was commenting on that group, they would say that, oh, that's our ministers. And inside that group, in their conversation, the word lead, I mean, I don't have a time machine to prove this empirically, but I know you would not have even heard the word leader or leadership in the 1.5 hour conversation those guys having breakfast. They wouldn't even use it. They didn't think of themselves that way.
Right, shepherds, right? It
But
was a shepherding movement.
shepherds, pastors, ministers, right?
Yeah.
Servants, diakonos, right? But today, what do you think? What do you think, Jesse? If there were 5 local pastors having breakfast for an hour and a half, how many times would the word leader or leadership pop up in their conversation? It
I
would
don't know, I think it's
dominate.
probably therapy now.
Well, it should be. It
Mental health,
depends.
mental health.
It depends on it depends on their cognitive dissonance, right?
Right,
So
the rooms I'm in anyway.
yeah, yeah.
What do you think, and this is also to help, you share some about what you found and kind of the case you make in the Atlas Factor. Like, what do you think the goal was of all that leadership development talk and training? And, what was the telos for
Mhm.
that huge wave that you're a little older than me. So, like, you're on the front end of, and I'm kinda
So
on the
kind,
tail end of,
so
you know?
gentle.
Yeah, what do you think their goal was? 'Cause it
Well, I
wasn't to
think it was
multiply
too.
churches, right? It wasn't that. So what was it?
Well, I think it was to run the churches that had multiplied. So, I mean, you had the church growth movement was in everybody's ear, and it was in all the seminaries that were all being hugely impacted by that. So, how to run these things? They were looking for a new way to run them, and so this is why they started inventing, even new positions. You know, I guess 35 years ago, executive pastor, so executive pastors come in, and now they run the staff. And so it's not uncommon. In fact, and I'm just going to say it, you can go to the main website for executive pastors right now, and you can look up the job descriptions that they suggest, and you'll see things that'll basically just totally leave any theological training or any pastoral training as an addendum. It's like you should have, to be an executive pastor, you need to have run a business of, that has is brought in X amount gross each year, has X amount of employees, da 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 da, and then way down in the bullet list, you'll say, a theological degree or experience in a local church is great. It'd be that's nice to have too, but you got to really have this business acumen to run this thing. So it just comes in and it dominates. But I think that, getting back to your question, I think they were trying to figure out a way, and the only way they could figure was turn into, you boss people. That's what we grew up with. We grew up with coaches that bossed us. Your first job, at a McDonald's, or at a landscape company or whatever, you're getting bossed. You're getting told what to do, and so we just imported that. So I serving. is in serving within leadership. See, I don't even like the word servant leadership, because I don't think we need it. I think we've got to get stronger about this stuff. We always think we got to tack onto it. Jesus didn't think he needed to tack onto it. He said the greatest is a servant. He didn't say the greatest is a servant leader. So, in fact, he even said in Matthew 23, when he said, don't call yourself father, don't call yourself teacher, he said, don't call yourself leader. So the Catholics call their top guy father, and we love to call each other leader. We just do the exact what Jesus said don't do.
So what do you think is the instead? With the You and I have talked about how the more business like paradigm, and I'm not anti-business. I've run business organizations and
Sure.
even took Harvard classes on entrepreneurial leadership. So one of the most famous HBR articles is the difference between a manager and a leader, and
Hmm.
just kind of setting up those their postures. What do you think the church should look like? How how do we regain maybe what we've lost over the last 7,500 years?
Yeah. Well, I think it should look like a body. I think that's why you see that Paul uses this metaphor so often. Is it's a body and it has a head, and that head is named Jesus. And so I think it's a beautiful metaphor, and you see Paul use it many times, not the least of which Romans 12, and just talk about the different giftings of the different members. Doesn't mean that every member has the same power, has the same, or as he uses the term faith to use, it's the ability to use that gift, but everyone has the same status. And that's the thing about it, is this is a difference in status. And so a person that comes in as a servant is a person that looks at other people as their equal in status. So you can have a baseball team, and you can have an Aaron Judge that's like 6'8" or however big that Goliath is, and he's just an Adonis in the way he's built, and he's hitting 60, 65 home runs a year. But in any given game, your skinny second baseman may be up to bat in a clutch time, and he's hitting 250, but he hits a double, or he hits a single, he drives in the game winning run. You don't take the bat out of his hand, right? Because he's gifted in his own way. And so there's equal status, even though there may not be equal power, or as far as the ability to use a gift. And Jesus goes to great strains to lay this out. And so when he gets to that ultimate statement in John 20, or in Matthew 20, 25, and 28, that we're all familiar with, when his disciples are jockeying for position, and James and John have got their mama to come up and ask him for this great position in his kingdom. And he said, and the other disciples get ticked off about it. And, he says, hey, sit down here. I got to tell you something. You all know that the Gentiles dominate one another. They practice the lordship over one another. It will not be this way among you. The one that'll be that will be the least, will be the servant. The one that will be the greatest will be last. And then what we usually stop there, but if we were to keep reading, we would see all the way John 21 and John 22 is where he lays out the the parable of the vineyard owner that goes early in the morning and hires people to come and work. Hey, I'll give you a day's wage if you'll come. He takes them to the vineyard. He comes back 9 o'clock in the morning, hires some more people. I'll pay you what's fair, he says. You know the whole deal. He does it at noon. He does it at 3 o'clock. He does it towards the end of the day. And then he tells his servant, he says, okay, end of the day, call all the workers together so I can pay them for today. He says, but bring the ones that we hired last first. And he gives them exactly what he had promised the other guys at 8 in the morning. Of course, the guys at the back of the line now are thinking, man, this is great. And the parable. So by the time he starts working up, he's giving them all the same amount. And these guys are livid because they think they're going to get more. Not only that, and this is what we miss so often, not only that, they worked all day. What happens when you've worked all day? At the end of the day, what do you want to do? I want to go home, man. I want to go home. I want to chill. I want to get something to drink. I worked a hard day out here in the sun. They get paid last. They have to stand in line longer than anybody. These guys that just started at the end of the day, they got paid. They got to go ahead and, you know, hit the beer, hit the bar, right? And I'm waiting. Jesus is emphasizing this. And so he's saying the last will be first and the first will be last. And he says the word so that there will be equality. You are equal. Then he continues all the way into Matthew 23. And this is when he just keeps grinding and says, don't call yourself leader. Don't call yourself this. Don't call yourself that. Don't use rank-based titles. So that Matthew 20 passage goes all the way through Matthew 23 in context. Jesus is emphasizing equality of status. Why? Because we're a body. And so I wrote the book Atlas Factor because it came about from a metaphor. In fact, Rob Wagner and Alan Hirsch and I wrote a book called The Starfish and the Spirit. And I had put a metaphor in there, not some brain. I mean, it's things we've all thought of before. I was just thinking about how the typical job description of being a pastor is like being Atlas. You know, it's like, oh, you got to be the top theologian, you got to be a marriage expert, you got to be a family expert, you got to be a fundraiser, you're the face of it, you know, all this stuff that's yeah. And oh, by the way, we need you to deliver about 45 to 50 phenomenal talks a year. Uh, I mean, who can do that? Who do we think we are? And not only who do we think we are, it's not fair to get that pressure from a congregation to expect us to deliver all that. So you're playing Atlas. And this is why so many, you know, guys and gals burn out. I planted and lasted 10 years. That's why when I look at these people that are still pastoring churches, I visited a buddy back where I planted just a few months ago. He planted within months of when I did in the mid 90s, and he's still doing it. And his name's Dave. And I'm just like, Dave, I mean, you're amazing, brother. Just, you know, the long obedience in the same direction, just amazing. But most of us, I mean, God was changing my trajectory anyway, but a lot of people burn out because you're trying to carry the weight of the world. So I was thinking about this Atlas metaphor, and I had actually posted a quote from our friend Neil Cole. And I don't even remember, I posted on Facebook or something, and I don't remember exactly what the post said, but it was something along the lines of the he said something along the lines of the wisdom of the head is disseminated into the body, but when it gets disrupted, it causes a problem. Well, I had another friend that reposted my post, you know, shared it. His chiropractor made a comment on it, which came back to me. And his chiropractor practices what they call upper cervical care, which is a specialty within chiropractic. And he just focuses on the C1 and the C2 vertebra. Now, Jesse, as we're talking, you've just recently had spinal surgery. So
Yep, yep, a
you
fusion
may have all
C5 through C7, so the lower end of the
yeah.
neck, right
Yeah.
above
So
the
you're
shoulders.
at the
Yeah.
lower,
I still have my
but these,
mobility because I still have the
yeah.
upper part.
Yeah. So and that's it. So the C1 and the C2, the C1, so this chiropractor quotes, he goes, "Oh, that's what I deal with in upper cervical care." And he says the problem is when the C1 and the C2 when there's a disruption and the wisdom of the head doesn't get disseminated into the body. And then he makes the statement. He said the body has all the intelligence it needs. It just needs no interruption between itself and the head.
Hmm,
Well, man,
so
and he
profound.
said this, and he said the C1's called the atlas vertebra, and I was like, holy smokes! So then, being how we are, Jesse. So four books on chiropractic later that I read. I'm not kidding. I'm like, I gotta find out about this. So I just go into this. I'm like, man, the metaphor is just never ending because the body is this neural network. I'm not telling you anything. Okay. In fact, I'm intimidated right now to even talk about neurology around you. Okay. Anyway, the body is this neural network, right? And so it has everything it needs to do, but you can walk into a room. In fact, I've got two friends that both of them had sons at 17 have spinal cord injuries, one in a football game, one in a motorcycle wreck. And I visited both those boys, and you can walk into the living room and they could be sitting on a couch or they could be sitting in a chair. They look fine. You wouldn't know anything was wrong with them, but there's no movement from the waist down. They can't move. Why? Because there was, it got the nerves from the head to the body got disrupted, got interrupted. And I am convinced that in the body of Christ today, the reason that the body of Christ in most instances, in most local churches, there's no movement because we've got men and in some instances women or both that are playing the head. They're playing the head. And so some people even use that term, the head pastor, which is a real scary thing to say because there's only one head pastor. There's only one chief pastor, chief shepherd, right? And Peter pointed that out, and it's Jesus. So
And
I'm
Hebrews says
convinced that
it
through these
too.
systems,
Mhm.
yes, and I'm convinced that we have lost through our systems by playing Atlas, that we have effectually disconnected the head to the body. And so we have a body that looks great. It just isn't going anywhere. And we don't have movement. So, and we have a lot of paralysis of a lot of very capable, effectual members because of our management systems. And so this creates an issue that is system wide within the church. And so you have to rebuild your systems. And so I do not believe that we just wipe out the leadership. It's no, we need to replace it with a different type of leadership, which means that your policies and your practices completely have to have an overhaul in the way that we deal with one another in the church.
I mean, I think what we've tried to do with, like, the leadership, there's a leadership crisis on one end that people aren't, like, coming through the ranks, they're not coming through the pipeline, they're not climbing the ladders, and more, like, Gen Z is not gonna do that, right? So, under 30, they're not gonna do the full-time vocational thing. Very, very rarely, they just have a strong
Mhm.
conviction not to do that, which I think is from the Lord. So, you have on one hand, you have a leadership development crisis. On the other hand, people think, well, the reason why we have leadership failure or these pastors with moral failure, maybe we just need to do better in the way that we train. And so they people look at both of those issues and they just want to train better. They just want to have better classes. They just want to have a better curriculum. And what I know about the way that the human brain is designed is that we're not created for one person to be the head. In fact, when a person experiences power, and this is research, this comes out of business research. When
Mm,
you have a person who has like a CEO or someone who's the head of an organization and they maintain that role for a long time, that it starts to unwire their mirroring mechanism, which means when
mm,
I look at you, because of mirroring, I can look at you, and if I do something or say something and you react a certain way, I feel that emotion too, right? So I feel the feelings that I create in you. When we have somebody who's been in power for a long time, they've had to do things to people. They've had to fire, they've had to yell, they've had to,
mm,
or maybe not yell, like they've had to exert a power differential, and if their mirroring mechanism remains intact, then they feel the impact as if they're doing it to themselves. So, if you're in power for a while, that starts to erode 'cause and then you start to be able to do things to other people that you don't feel. So
mm,
mirroring then erodes, and then that erodes empathy, and empathy is that feeling, I feel what I'm doing to you, And empathy is a social when we do that socially, it's called morality. So if we disconnect and unwire mirroring, then we erode empathy, which then erodes morality. And so it's not necessarily that we're not training people well enough in order to maintain position of solo leadership, but that we're not created in our design
Yes.
to be able to do that. Like it's
Yes.
not a it's not just it's not a character flaw. It's a systems
Yes.
flaw.
Yes.
The
We're
system is
not built. I
setting
mean,
us up
that's
for
so
failure.
powerful. We're not built for it. And that's why none of us were ever designed to be king. And so, I had have a young man just the other day. He was really, he's like a son to me. He was one of my church planting interns 20 years ago. And he was telling me the other day, he was talking with a friend of ours that's an older guy. He's actually older than me, believe it. Pastors a large church. And he was this young man was asking him, hey, why do you think all these pastoral failures, so many of these? And he said, do you think it's a problem with the system? And seriously, here's what the guy said. He said, no, it's not the system. He said, these guys just need to have better hearts. And it's like, no, the system will make you this way. Look what it did to David, a man after God's own heart. Look what it did to him. You're not made to be king. You're not designed to be king. And but I think that our imagination is so locked up in it. It sounds like crazy talk. What you and I are saying here sounds like crazy talk. What do you
Huh.
mean? The buck stops here. It has to stop somewhere. So, someone has to make a final decision. Da da da. There. We just cut off the notion that there could be a different way to do it, and that there could be a better way, to do it, and that there could be a different form of accountability, mutual accountability.
Right,
There could
shared
be a
leadership, polycentric
shared
leadership.
leadership, mutual submission, non-vertical accountability, but a constellation of accountability, these different things. And which actually is more accountability than vertical accountability.
Yep,
That's the irony of it, right?
yep, yep. Having served in
So,
those, it's way more intense. You're way more accountable. Um,
absolutely.
and your heart is way more known. Um,
Yeah.
the interesting thing about the whole like the Lord did set us up to fail if we're a king or a solo leader, but he set us up to be successful if we just have people around us who roll their eyes at us. If we can experience low power moments, if we can have
Mm,
friendships where they're like, "Dude, what are you doing?" And
yeah.
that pure accountability, we it that shapes us well. We're created to respond to that through empathy and through mirroring so that we can be moral together. We actually aren't created to do it individually, but we are created to do it all together. So,
Yes.
this different idea of a body working together with the buck stops with the Holy Spirit, which I think is somewhere in Acts, I think it talks about
Somewhere,
that.
somewhere in there a dozen times or more, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think
but okay, so right there. But let's take that. So, what is
hmm,
it? Is Acts 15? Is it Acts 15 or 16? Um,
I'm not good with the
some
addresses. That's why I never
okay.
drop them. 'em. I'm not good with the addresses.
Okay, so, so many people will point there and say, when there was this big decision to be made, that then James said, "Here's what I've decided." And everybody point, see right there, he was the guy, the Bucks. No, you look at it, you don't even have to go to the Greek. Go to the NIV. I don't care. Okay. You he said, here's my opinion. Here's what I say. And then it says, and it seemed good to the apostles, the elders, and the church that was gathered to send Paul and Barnabas, blah, 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 blah. Okay. It says it. This is
Yeah.
the way they made a decision,
It
right?
was
But we
collective.
just immediately cherry pick and make, well, this is really what we're going to do here. But this is what makes, the fivefold and everything work. But once again, people will take fivefold and say, well, the apostles boss. No, the apostle's not boss. The The apostle has a particular gift and a better and more strength in that gifting than the others do. But there may be a time when you need that pastor, that shepherd voice to be louder, right? Because the prophet's about to bring the hammer down on somebody, and the pastor says, "Let me take the hammer out of
Let
your
me step in.
hand and
Let me
let's,"
step in.
right? Exactly. Right. So that's why there has to be equality so that there's no fear to speak, to roll the eyes, to speak up. But in so many of these leveraged, heavy handed leadership systems, you know better than to speak up. You know better than, I mean, it's what Driscoll called the sin of questioning. You don't question, right?
Yeah.
And so you end up, especially when people's livelihood depends on not rubbing the boss or whatever, then it just creates a culture where all that mirroring and everything that you're talked about, all that starts breaking down, man. It all That's why we get it's the system. That's why nobody can see it right now, but that's why I'm wearing a cap right now that says it's the system, stupid.
And the good news is that we could get into a different system and all of that effort and all of that energy and all of that time. Instead of doing leadership development, we do discipleship. And then people's
Yes.
hearts are better, right? It answers, we put all of that effort and energy and sincerity. So, because people are really sincere about wanting to do the right thing. At least that's been my experience. Nobody's trying to control. I mean, there are a few, but
No,
like for the most part, people aren't
and
trying
I
to
think that the
control and manage.
majority yeah, I think the majority of pastors, man, I love pastors, and I think by far the majority of them, they're doing it for the right reasons, and they have the right heart, and this is not a mega or a small thing either, a church deal either. I mean, you and I both know, Jesse. I mean, you can have a church of 35 people, and there's some dude that's his little fiefdom. I mean, he's a dictator maniac. So
Yeah, they end up
it's
calling those
not just
cults.
they do call those cults, right? And so it can be either it can be either or, right? So
Yeah.
it's in all these, but it does come down to discipleship and disciple making, and that's our job. I mean, that's the thing, and that's where I think that so much of the leadership cult, the leadership industrial complex that's invaded the church, I think it gets us off of our calling, and
Hmm.
so most pastors today that view themselves, their identity as leaders, they're not waking up in the morning thinking, man, I can't wait to get to the office to ask Brian and Debbie and Stephen and Jackie what they need from me today, how I can resource them, how I can serve them, how I can do what Ephesians 4 says, equip them best. No, they're thinking, as soon as I get to the office, I'm going to tell Brian he needs to do this. I'm going to check with Jackie, make sure she took care of what I told her to do yesterday. Da 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 da. You're to be an equipper. That's your primary job, is to be a coach, not a boss, and to be a equipper and not a director. So this changes, but it gets exciting because you start I mean, that's something more exciting, I would think, to wake up to in the morning to get to do than to get to manage people.
Yeah, managing is, I mean, that's how you get a job done, but equipping and discipleship and empowerment is how you live a life. So,
Yeah, and that's how you
I
get
think it is
movement.
exciting. Well, if people wanna pick up your book, The Atlas Factor, where can they find that?
Yeah, I mean, Amazon's usually the best place to go. So it's there. It's there in all forms, electric, audio, and old school, where you can
Old school
smell it
paperback.
and highlight it. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. Well, you and I, we can talk about this kind of stuff for a long, a long time and nerd out. But I just appreciate you coming on and sharing. I love to see the effort that people put into being a disciple actually go in the direction, take them in the direction, breaking these false narratives that the enemy is kind of
Yes.
seated in that get us off course, so that all of that energy and effort we can see the fruit of that because we're doing it God's way. So
Amen.
appreciate you. Thanks, Lance. It's
Appreciate
so
you
good to
too,
have you
Jesse.
on.
Yeah. Thanks. It's always fun to visit with you.
All right. Well, you have been with us for the Ordinary Discipleship podcast. If you want, you can check out more resources at whoology.co. That's WHOOLOGY.co. And there's resources there for shared leadership, for ordinary disciple making, for leadership coaching in ways that are healthy and ways that help you connect and support and guide and coach other people. So we'll see you next time.